Curtis had called just that morning, his voice crackling slightly over the line from across the ocean, asking how things were around the house. His usual routine, checking in. I told him everything was fine, as it always was. What else would I say? He rambled a bit about the boys, their soccer games, and something about little Tom developing a taste for croissants that the French apparently made in a way you can't back home. I nodded absently, although he couldn't see me, just letting him go on until he finally signed off with that perfunctory "love you" that used to sound more heartfelt. I suppose we both knew the score. We cared for each other, yes, but love felt like a word we used out of habit more than out of the bubbling romance it once meant. And when he hung up, I realized it again. The quiet, this crushing silence weighed heavier than I liked to pretend. It had been building up, brick by brick, since the kids all moved away. Curtis filled his silence with visits and stories of France, but me, I didn't have much left to fill mine with, besides some afternoons drinking tea at the garden table and flipping through forgotten gardening magazines. Just the same monotonous routine, the same ticking of the wall clock louder in the quiet moments. And now there was a leak, something physical to break rather than whatever was quietly crumbling inside of me. It wasn't a serious problem, just the sink. Little drip drip coming from underneath. Curtis usually handled this sort of thing, taking out his toolkit, as he muttered about the damn pipes never being good in the first place. That's why I called the handyman. Just something to get done. Simple. I didn't even care enough to look into reviews or make sure I'd called the right number. I wanted things fixed, I didn't care who did it. When I opened the door, I halfway expected someone who'd match our age, some grizzled man with a gut, familiar with decades of fixing broken tiles and plumbing failures. What I got was anything but. Zane stood there, framed by the doorway, young, too young, if I'm honest, and confidently awkward. His dark hair was messy, like he got out of bed, threw on a shirt that fit a bit too well, and headed straight over. His bright blue eyes caught on mine for a second too long, likely surprised at seeing not a doddering elderly woman but, well, me. 60 with silver in my hair, sure, but still holding on to some form of who I used to be before age and routine softened me. Madame Maeve. I nodded, suddenly aware of how small my house felt with him standing there. His voice, casual, cut through the stale air of the place, like he'd physically moved something that hadn't shifted in years. It was such a simple thing, but I don't know why that struck me. I stepped back to let him in and led him to the kitchen, keeping quiet because, well, what was I going to say? Thanks for coming because I'm incompetent when it comes to sinks, I suppose. Instead, my thoughts ran away from me. I focused too much on his broad shoulders as they passed by, how straight he stood compared to Curtis's slight slouch from years, working behind a desk. Maybe I should have just hired someone else, but it was too late for that, and he didn't seem to notice the awkward silence that had settled. The fluorescent lights in the kitchen illuminated everything wrong. The peeling wallpaper in the corner, the faint crack above the window I hadn't touched in months. He knelt in front of the sink, pulling out a toolkit from the little bag he had slung over his shoulder. I stood there, feeling like a spectator in my own house, watching him undo years of neglect that Curtis never bothered to fix properly. But Zane just looked so at home, while doing it like this wasn't a job, just another everyday task, like breathing, walking, fixing another middle-aged woman's leak. His hands glided over pipes as I stood by the counter, too close for comfort, but too distant to be helpful. I could have stepped back, given him space, I should have, but something tethered me to that kitchen like I was part of the problem he needed to solve. It's just a loose gasket here, he said, his voice pulling me back from wherever my mind had wandered off to. As if he'd noticed me looking, did I look like some schoolgirl with a crush? God, I hope not. He didn't seem to acknowledge anything of the sort, at least, just kept talking. I won't take long. I nodded again, feeling ridiculous for even being in the room. But instead of leaving, I leaned against the counter, watching a little more intently. His arms flexed with each turn of the wrench, muscles shifting effortlessly under his skin. And I reminded myself to breathe normally. My mouth felt embarrassingly dry. I was old enough to be his mother, for heaven's sake, what was I even? And yet I stayed rooted, half listening to the rhythmic sound of him working. I swore it should have been uncomfortable, but it wasn't quite that. Just different. Zane was bent low, his upper body mostly beneath the kitchen sink, fiddling with the wrench as I stood a little behind him. I should have found something else to do, maybe picked up a book or put on some music, but I couldn't. I just didn't want to move. He'd lean forward slightly, his shirt bunching together just enough for me to catch a glimpse of skin at his waist, and I'd feel this strange flutter in my stomach. His broad shoulders were framed by the simple, worn fabric of that work shirt, the way it stretched so tight across his back when he shifted. My hands itched, almost without realizing what for. 20 years ago I'd been that woman, radiant, vibrant, and so sure of myself, but now, a little past 60, with those damn creases at the corners of my eyes, and what was left of the spark between Curtis and me flickering its last embers, I tell myself it's just life. It's just how things go. Except right now there was a charged air filling the kitchen I didn't quite recognize but couldn't deny. Every bolt Zane turned under the sink, every slight grunt of effort he made sent my thoughts spiraling in all the wrong directions. He glanced up, catching my gaze for an unsettling, fleeting moment before his eyes darted back to the task in front of him. Did he notice? I blinked, feigning distraction by stacking dishes or pretending to rearrange the countertop. Get a grip, Maeve. I almost wanted to say, but my body wasn't listening. There was this inexorable pull like gravity, pulling me closer to him, toward the heat of his solid presence. When I crossed the room again, pretending to inspect the curtains by the window this time, I realized I was standing too close to him, his legs tucked under the cabinetry, and suddenly I became acutely aware of just how near I stood, close enough that he could reach out an arm and touch me without trying much at all. It felt intoxicating. I hadn't been this awake in years, not in the way that counted. I couldn't even say when the last time was Curtis and I had touched like this, truly without the weight of distant expectation or routine. Real touch, real warmth. Need any help? Everything going all right with the sink? My voice came quieter than intended, almost like a whisper laced with too much softness. Looking back, it felt heavy. Out of place, not in the way you help a handyman who's working a job. The tension snapped taut when Zane looked up at me again, his blue eyes as confused as mine, though neither of us moved. He didn't respond, the pause stretching long enough that the only sound in the room was some distant drip from the faucet. I let my eyes drift down, away from his lips, but not before noticing the fullness of them. And then, for reasons I can't explain, I did it. I reached out, placing my hand gently on his shoulder, fingers curling around the fabric of his shirt. His whole body stiffened under my palm, like he understood exactly what was happening, and was still figuring out how things reached this point. The leak didn't matter anymore. Nothing in the house did. He did. His presence, his skin beneath the shirt, his breath heavier but controlled. His neck arched awkwardly from his position beneath the sink, looking up at me. Whatever unspoken line should have stayed between us suddenly vanished. You seem like you're doing well with it, I murmured, some part of me grateful for how ridiculous that sounded. It was almost a laughable deflection, because what I cared most about wasn't how well he worked. I let my hand fall slowly from his shoulder, but not before dragging it down the length of his upper arm, feeling the muscles tighten beneath his shirt. His eyes held mine for a second too long before dropping to where my hand rested briefly against his chest. And I leaned forward, just slightly, just enough, to press the weight of my presence closer. My dress, that simple thing I'd thrown on out of routine, brushed softly against his side as I bent down further. The smooth cotton grazing his arm felt significant, revealing way too much of myself beneath all the delicate folds of fabric. You're strong, I said, my voice slipping into territory I'd spent so long avoiding. Intoxicated by something entwined between us, I felt him shifting under my closeness, like he was still deciding whether to cross the threshold. He hadn't replied yet, but his body did. His resistance felt like a fragile thing on the edge of collapsing, the tension between us hanging like an invisible thread. When I let my hand drift lower, tracing lightly across his stomach through the fabric, it was enough. Whatever small fight in him stopped then. He exhaled sharply. My pulse raced when his hand, quick, deliberate, moved toward me and caught my wrist, stopping it. I don't know which of us gave in first, but suddenly we were moving, fast and desperate, like something had broken loose inside. We didn't talk. The silence was filled with the frantic need to somehow close that distance we'd both pretended wasn't there. He rose to his feet in an instant, and I let him pull me, not upstairs, not to the bed, but straight toward the sofa in the corner of the room. The sunlight filtering from the window became too bright, blinding, but I didn't care. We tumbled over the cushions, his hands pushing up the hem of my dress with more confidence than reservation. The dress that left no barrier between us made every inch of skin bared frighteningly, thrillingly real. We fused together there with the lazy hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. Days turned into weeks. I couldn't say the point where Zane and I crossed over from a harmless distraction to something that consumed me. Maybe it was after the first time, lying there on that damn sofa, the heat of our bodies still clinging to the fabric while I pulled my dress back down to something resembling decency. Or maybe it was the way he'd grin when he came by afterward, that careless, youthful swagger I hadn't seen in anyone around me in years. Curtis would call from France, mostly in the evenings when his voice sounded more upbeat, talking about the grandsons David, who had started soccer, or Thomas, who was learning French faster than Curtis could keep up. I'd murmur the right things, nodding along to his stories, but my mind was never fully with him. Zane's visits had dug some kind of fissure in me. Even those phone calls, once a small comfort in my otherwise dull days, had lost their meaning. Every ring on the phone now felt like a break from the anticipation, something that stalled me from him. Each time Zane came to the house under the guise of fixing something, plumbing this week, a broken light the next, it felt like an unspoken spell between us. We never talked about it, exactly. Never agreed on what this had become. But the moment that door closed behind him, our hands were on each other in seconds. We were past pretense. No longer pretending he was there just to patch something up. The sofa ended up being the stage for it all, the place that sharply contrasted against the routine life I had with Curtis. God, it had been years since I'd felt this way. The kind of desperate urgency that filled up every moment of silence. The thud of Zane's boots against the floor sent my heart racing, my body drawn to his shamelessly, like I couldn't stop if I tried. It wasn't just physical though, well, not entirely. I told myself it was. I needed that excuse to dull any guilt that threatened to creep in. But it was more than lust. Zane made me feel like I was still someone. A woman who wasn't fading behind quiet routines and years of stability. He looked at me with favor, with that hunger that I hadn't seen in Curtis's eyes for what felt like lifetimes. No, with Curtis we were just two people who survived through the silence, sharing meals, sleeping in the same bed, but never touching. Not like this. Not like Zane. With him it felt urgent, reckless even. And maybe, just maybe, that dangerous edge made it impossible to stop. We got bolder. At first it was just during the day, him dropping by sometime after work. But it didn't take long before even daytime meetings weren't enough. I started leaving the back door unlocked at night. I hadn't expected how that small act alone, just the knowledge of him sneaking in while the rest of the world lay quiet, would fuel this rush. The very fragility of it, hovering on the edge of being caught, turned it into something even more potent. It was the way my breath caught when I heard his footsteps barely above a whisper in the hallway, knowing he was just steps from that same couch, where we'd wrap ourselves around each other like the walls didn't exist. The kitchen became a new guilty favorite. The late hours felt different there, darker, more like we were hiding in plain sight. The grating hum of the refrigerator, the coolness of the tile against my knees when he pushed me toward it. How hadn't I noticed until then that it was more thrilling to take the risk in these familiar places? The same kitchen where Curtis and I had shared so many boring breakfasts over the years. Now, the countertops weren't just for coffee mugs but became something between Zane's hands and mine. And I relished it. I stopped bothering with things like undergarments when I knew he'd be coming. It's what he liked, and hell, it was easier that way. He'd growl these low, filthy compliments under his breath, whenever he'd find that I'd kept myself bare beneath one of my summer dresses, pulling me against him before we could even reach the sofa, his hands greedy, impatient. I tried telling myself it was harmless, a way to feel alive again, but that justification held less water with each passing week. Some nights, while curled up in bed next to Curtis, I'd still feel the rush of Zane's hands on me, the heat of his breath on the back of my neck. And when I lay there, wide awake, hearing Curtis's soft snoring, I couldn't even muster guilt. More than anything, there was just a dull ache that rose in me that I didn't recognize. The guest house had been where we ventured when we felt especially bold. It was barely used anymore, mostly storage, but that made it feel even more delicious. A little hideaway from the rest of the world. There'd be this charged tension before we'd even make it inside, like the air between us got thick, and the second the door creaked open, we were all over each other. I couldn't help but notice that Zane's grin had grown more confident over time. Like he knew exactly what I needed before even I did. There wasn't that initial awkwardness between us anymore. Any bit of shyness had evaporated after those first forbidden kisses in the kitchen. It felt dangerous, every goddamn second of it, and I hadn't felt anything that exciting in years. I couldn't stop, wouldn't stop, even as Curtis started talking about how he'd be coming back soon. Even as one of my friends offhandedly mentioned that life seems quieter for you these days, Maeve, with a knowing tilt to her voice when I'd run into her at the market. She'd been terrified of the loneliness left behind after the kids, the grandkids. But what scared me was that I hadn't been lonely at all anymore, not with Zane. The thing that terrified me, though, was that I didn't think I wanted to pull away. Even with the risk of Curtis finding out looming closer than ever, I didn't care. Every time Zane touched me, every stolen night, every reckless moment spinning around that kitchen or on that damn old couch, it was worth it. Things had slipped past a point where I could pretend it would stop. Or maybe that was the lie I kept telling myself, night after night. It was the day before Curtis was due to come back from France, and that weight settled somewhere deep inside me, pressed down by the ticking of the clock on the wall. I knew it was risky, so damn risky, but I couldn't bring myself to care anymore. Zane showed up in the afternoon, like he always did, except this time. I could see it in his eyes the moment he stepped through the door. He was restless, that easy confidence gone, replaced by something tight around his mouth. He barely crossed the threshold, rubbing at the back of his neck, glancing toward the driveway like he was expecting Curtis to burst in at any second. "Maeve, it ain't right," he muttered. He avoided my eyes, like he was talking himself into leaving, maybe for good. Most days that would have cut through me, maybe even made me pause. But today, all I felt was the pull, the urgency gnawing at my bones, knowing this could be the last time, and I wasn't ready to let that slip through my fingers. "Curtis isn't home yet, you know that." My voice came out sharper than I intended, a little too direct. But I didn't step back. I stood close, just close enough to feel the air between us spark like it had every other time. I reached out like I had before, resting my fingers on his forearm, squeezing gently, grounding myself in him. He stared down at my hand, and for a second, I thought he might pull away. He was jittery, anxious in a way I wasn't used to. But then his shoulders slumped, like he'd stopped fighting whatever was waging war inside that head of his. In that tiny moment, it felt like I had won some battle he didn't even realize he was losing. "Last time, Maeve, this is the last," he finally said. His voice was low, but there was something final in it. I didn't respond. I just turned toward the stairs, and I knew he'd follow. The house was so goddamn quiet, the only sound the soft creak of the steps as we moved toward the bedroom. My heart hammered against my ribs, but it wasn't from nerves. It was something else, something that clawed at me, made me want to hold on to whatever this was between us, until it slipped away completely. Zane hesitated a bit at the bedroom door, but I didn't give him time to think about it. I slipped out of my dress with one smooth motion, letting the fabric pool at my feet without a second thought. He stood there for a beat, frozen, and I saw that look I craved, lust and confusion, all tangled up in those blue eyes of his. For a guy so used to fixing things with his hands, he never quite knew what to do with them when it came to me. But I wasn't waiting. I climbed onto the bed, and he didn't need much more convincing. I didn't even hear the front door open. We were too caught up, his rough hands on my skin, his lips at my neck. It was supposed to be quick, one final time, because Curtis was coming home soon. But then came the voices, familiar ones. My stomach plummeted. "Maeve." Curtis's voice had a way of cutting through the air like a knife, sharp and unmistakable. I yanked the sheet up, covering myself, my mind a blur of panic as Zane leaped from the bed, looking frantically around for his clothes. The front door creaked open wider, footsteps echoed, closer. And then, "Oh God, my sons." Curtis, alias Quentin. They flooded the doorway, locking eyes with me, then sliding horrified to Zane, who was trying to scramble into his jeans. The room went still, suffocating in that heavy tension. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Curtis was the first to speak, though speak isn't the right word for it. His voice roared through the room, shaking the walls. "What the hell is this?" He stood there, his face red, eyes wild with shock and fury. My mouth opened. Nothing. I couldn't form words, my voice caught in my throat. Zane, half covered in his shirt, looked as if he wanted to disappear into the wallpaper. Elias and Quentin, God, I couldn't believe they were standing there too, stared, wide-eyed at the scene, their expressions twisted in disgust. And then it happened so fast I barely registered it. Elias lunged like a wolf, a single blow sending Zane flying across the room. The crack of fist against jaw echoed, almost drowned out by the sound of Zane hitting the floor. "Elias," I screamed, clutching the sheet tighter to me, but I barely finished before Quentin was on him too, grabbing the front of Zane's shirt and slamming him back against the wall. Zane groaned, still trying to pull his pants up, mumbling some pathetic apology. But Quentin twisted his fist into Zane's shirt harder, holding him there against the cold drywall. Quentin was the calm one, normally the quiet one. But now, his face held a fierceness I'd rarely seen in my son. Lip curled, nose flared, Quentin was speaking through gritted teeth. "You touched my mom?" His voice was low, but every word dripped with venom. Curtis had the boys, my grandsons, Jesus. He rushed them out before they could witness the madness unraveling in our bedroom. I caught a glimpse of their confused, little faces from the corner of my eye, peeking in from behind Curtis's legs before he swept them into the hallway. My heart shattered. This wasn't just about Zane, about me. This was tearing through all of them. Zane was coughing, holding out his arms to block Elias, but there was no stopping them. Elias came back over, landing heavy blows, each punch harder than the last. Quentin finally let Zane drop, but only so they could lay into him together. I couldn't reach them, caught between the railing of the bed and the tangled sheets wrapped around me. God, I couldn't even move to stop it. "Please, stop!" I screamed until my voice cracked, clawing at the air, but they wouldn't stop. Everything I said became lost under the fury of their fists. A sickening thud lined the floor as Zane's head hit the hardwood. "You're a piece of shit, you know that?" Elias spat, towering over him. "You think this is okay?" Zane tried to slide away, but Quentin grabbed him by the ankle, dragging him back to his feet for more. One of Zane's eyes was swelling shut, his face a garish mess. I didn't recognize my sons. They weren't boys anymore, but violent strangers, punishing, unrelenting. And I had made this happen, invited this into our home. It felt like my skin was peeling off, raw and exposed under their shouts, their fists, the blood dotting my white bed sheets. Curtis reappeared in the doorway, enough rage in his eyes to start an earthquake. The boys pulled back as his presence filled the room. His voice, low and shaking, trembled with something darker than anger. "Get out." The words came out of him like a guttural growl, a command that echoed through the house. He wasn't saying it for Elias or Quentin, his eyes fixed solely on Zane, who was trying to pull himself upright, clutching his side. "Curtis, please," I choked, rushing forward, but Curtis shot me a glare that froze me mid-step. He wasn't ready to look at me. Maybe he never would again. Zane stumbled and then bolted. He didn't look at me as he hovered by the door, catching his breath for a fraction of a second before darting out. The door slammed shut behind him. The thud resonated across the silence left behind. I barely registered his words at first. The room pulsed with the aftermath, everything still vibrating with tension. Elias and Quentin had stormed out after Zane, leaving the front door wide open. Curtis didn't move, not right away. He just stood there, eyes blazing, his body rigid like he was holding himself back from doing something worse. And then the words came, hard and final, like stones hitting the ground. "You're no longer welcome in this house." I tried to speak, to explain how everything had spiraled, but no sound came when I opened my mouth. My throat felt raw, like I'd already been screaming. He didn't care anymore though, or maybe he did care, in the worst possible way. His disgust was palpable, etched across his face, a face I'd known for 3 decades but suddenly didn't recognize at all. He wasn't mine anymore, hadn't been for a long time, but hearing him say it broke me in ways I didn't anticipate. He didn't scream, didn't shout. That would have been easier to navigate, something I could absorb and respond to, reflect back with my own anger or pain. Instead, his voice was cold, calculated, every syllable a dagger. "You've disgraced this family," he said. No softness, no hesitation, just facts, delivered without room for argument. I could try to protest, to explain my loneliness, the aching gaps he never filled, but it wouldn't matter. There was nothing I could say that would make any of this right. I tried once more, a useless sound getting caught in my throat before he shut it down completely, pointing toward the door. "You'll stay in the guest house until we figure out what to do with you." The guest house. The irony wasn't lost on me. That's where Zane and I had spent stolen moments, justifying the unjustifiable, pretending for brief flashes that I was someone else. That house had been my world of escape, and now it was my exile. My feet didn't want to move. My body seemed glued to the kitchen tiles. When had those patterns become so foreign to me? I couldn't look at anything without it feeling like it was slipping from my grasp, like everything was unspooling faster than I could hold it together. Curtis didn't wait for me to process it all. He turned, back stiff, and walked away, leaving me standing amid the wreckage of the life we'd built, one I'd shattered in a way I wasn't sure could be pieced together again. Whether I wanted to fix it or not didn't even occur to me in that moment. All I knew was that I needed to leave the house. His house. I couldn't stay another second in the space we'd once shared. My body finally obeyed, moving on autopilot. I gathered a few things quickly, just the essentials. There wasn't time to think about it, nor the strength to turn around and really face what I was leaving behind. Clothes. The toothbrush. I shoved it all into a small bag, wiping my face with the back of my hand. He probably saw the tears, but I couldn't tell if he even looked back when I headed toward the guest house. Maybe he didn't see me at all, just the ghost of a woman who wasn't his wife anymore. Crossing the yard felt like retreat. Every step heavier than the last, like I was sinking into the earth. It wasn't until I reached the door and closed it behind me that the full weight of the moment hit. Sitting in the guest house, I stared at the fraying edge of the bedspread, fingers picking at a loose thread until it unraveled in rhythmic curls. The air was thick, stifling, making it hard to breathe, and the silence weighed heavier than any sound. The birds outside chirped oblivious, but their chatter didn't reach me. This small space, which once felt like a retreat, had become something else now, claustrophobic, uncomfortable. This was no respite, it was my exile. Through the thin walls I could hear them. Curtis, Elias, Quentin. Their voices too quiet to make out the words, but the tones, hushed, terse, loaded. I wasn't part of those conversations anymore. Just hours ago, this was my home. Now I was shut out, cut off from them, discarded like an errant piece that didn't fit. The disconnect between us felt more absolute than ever before, worse than when the boys had grown and left. Worse than any of the long pauses in Curtis and my marriage. Zane had been the interruption, the shaking of an old snow globe, everything suspended in my life disturbed and swirling. And then it crashed down, shattered in that horrible mess earlier. Quentin's face, how could I forget it? That rage burning bright, the sudden swing of his arm. I closed my eyes, but all I could see was Zane hitting the floor, him coughing, struggling to get back up, and me standing there, useless. My sons barely looked at me, focused entirely on Zaney, like he was some disease to be eradicated from their lives. Curtis, God, Curtis. He had barely glanced at me, much less spoken a word before ordering me out. That void in his expression, the years of our distance seemed to consolidate into that one gaze. The silence that followed, oppressive, a thing with teeth. I exhaled shakily. Part of me wanted to bang on the wall and scream at all of them. This was supposed to be my life too, my house. And now it wasn't. Now I was in this box, this little room with bad wallpaper and old memories. I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the window, a ghostly version of myself, unkempt hair, shoulders slumped. How had I become this? Not just a prisoner in my own home, but someone I didn't even recognize. The quiet, inevitable ticking of a clock from somewhere made it worse. Like time was prickling at me, reminding me how much had just been lost. And no matter what Zane had given me these past weeks, he was gone now, wasn't he? I swallowed past the knot in my throat. Gone. The thrill, the reprieve gone. I wasn't alive again, not in the way I wanted to believe. Zane wasn't going to show up again. I knew that the moment the door slammed behind him, leaving me with the sickening sound of his footsteps fading, just before all hell broke loose. I wondered if he limped away that night, whether his face was swollen and bleeding, tasting the metallic bitterness of the fists that connected with him. Maybe he ended up at some dingy apartment, lying on a battered couch nursing bruises both inside and out, a cold beer pressed to his split lip. I had no way of knowing, and honestly I knew better than to wait for any kind of explanation. I made him a ghost. There was a time when his silence would have driven me mad, but now it's almost a relief. Zane disappearing meant that his chapter in this wretched story was closed. There wouldn't be awkward phone calls, late-night visits, or tear-filled conversations, explaining why something so electric between us had to finally fizzle out. He must have sensed it too, when it all crashed down around us. Right there in that private moment, Curtis stomping in, followed by Elias and Quentin, it became very clear that regret had been boiling just beneath the surface the whole time. It wasn't lust anymore, not even guilt. It was fear. Fear sucks everything else dry. After Elias and Quentin threw punches, not holding back their rage, their betrayal, I remember Zane's face half twisted in pain but mostly shock. Getting caught isn't glamorous, it's graceless. It's raw. After they let him walk out, like a wounded animal, I didn't follow. I'd like to think part of me tried to scream out for him, tried to apologize, but my voice was stuck somewhere deep under layers of shame I didn't even know I was capable of feeling. There's no pretty way to put it. I was wrecked by it all. Maeve Rylant, the homemaker, wife of Curtis, mother of Elias and Quentin, had become this, a shadow banished to the corner of her own life. I felt it, though, that pull, wondering if Zane had someone to patch him up, or if he cared enough about everything that went down to feel hurt himself. But I knew the answer already. He walked away from me easily, much like someone stepping over a fresh grave. Moving on was survival for him. For me, I couldn't walk away. I was drowning in the mess I created, utterly suffocated by Curtis's silence. It had been days since Curtis had tossed me out to the guest house, not even looking me in the eye as I gathered my things. It was more humiliating because I hadn't thought twice about where we'd shared stolen moments before. Now the place felt cursed, like every laugh, every whispered conversation, was stained across the walls in brutal permanence. The air in here, too thick, too claustrophobic. Curtis hadn't visited once since telling me to stay here, and I guess I shouldn't have expected him to. People like Curtis took their time. They thought things over, calculated the damage. I knew he was somewhere inside our big, quiet house going over his options, determining how to clean up the wreckage I'd made of nearly 40 years of our lives. Whatever conclusion he'd come to, it wasn't going to involve gently forgiving me. When he finally stepped through that guest house door, I saw the lines of his face deeper than before, more pronounced. And his eyes, they weren't like I remembered. They were sharp, relentless. My heart seized the second he spoke, and I clung to the edge of the couch, the leather freezing under my palms. "What the hell were you thinking, Maeve?" His voice wasn't shaking with anger, but it cut right through everything else. He wasn't trying to hold back. It came simple, cold and sharp, as though there was no other way to put it. The question hung there between us, and I knew no matter how I answered, it wouldn't be good enough. It couldn't be. Nothing I could say would stitch back together what I'd shredded. I wanted to explain it, I really did. Maybe there'd been some way to word it that didn't make me out to be this aging, desperate woman who acted out of sheer loneliness. Maybe I could have convinced him it wasn't about Zane at all, that it wasn't about betraying him specifically. But when I tried, my voice broke. I couldn't call up any practiced reason, any justification. He didn't wait for me to stumble through it. Curtis had no patience for that. "You betrayed me. You betrayed us." His words slapped me harder than I'd ever imagined possible. The us hit like a punch. My boys, my marriage, my right to even stand beside them as one unit. Now I was separate, and Curtis was making damn sure I knew it. By the time I started sobbing, I realized I wasn't doing it because I wanted Curtis to see, or because I wanted him to forgive me. I cried because he was being so calm about it. The calm was horrifying. It was a steel trap, locking everything we had away, somewhere far I couldn't reach. He stared down at me, detached. "You'll stay out here until I figure out what to do with this marriage," was all he said before walking away. Not a turn back. Not even a glint of emotion on his face when I tried to apologize, to choke out any words that could fix this. But he wasn't staying to listen. That was the hardest part of it, to know he didn't care enough to stay angry, or even engage in the fight anymore. I was left standing in this damned guest house, alone, listening to the echo of that door slamming. Then silence, crushing silence. Now all I've got is time. Time to sit around in my exile and play it all back scene by scene in my head. The moments that once excited me, that once made me feel something rushing through my veins after years of numbness from routine, are now just bitter flashes that set my skin on fire with regret. The way my hand reached out for Zane's shoulder, that first stupid gesture of crossing the line, I wish I could erase it. How bold I'd thought I was then, how alive it made me feel. It's terrifying to realize just how deeply you can deceive yourself. Here, in this empty space, I know only one truth: I'm ruined. What felt intoxicating now reeks of embarrassment and poor judgment. Curtis's face when he saw us. That's what keeps coming back to me. His hard, weathered face, showing nothing of sadness or love, just a cold certainty, this is over.
Hey everyone, if you enjoyed the story, remember to like, subscribe and comment on the video for more stories like this. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss an update. If you have any similar stories to share, leave them in the comments and we'll make sure to bring them to life. Thanks for watching.